Let's add a custom cursor to Squarespace, but only to specific elements or sections. Here I have it set up for A elements or link elements. This is where you're going to notice that if I go across most of the page, the regular cursor shows up as normal, while when hovering over link elements like this title element in here, or the navigation items button over here, this text, the images, and this read more link, the cursor changes to my custom image. If you've never done this before, you'll see how easy it is to achieve by just using an image file and 3 lines of CSS. Yes, just 3. So let's go ahead and hop onto the custom CSS window to get started. First, you'll need to have an image file uploaded to your custom files area. I'd recommend working with an image size of 32 pixels by 32 pixels. I already have a pretty simple cursor loaded over here, so that's what I'm going to be working with. You can grab it from the blog post in case you want to quickly test out the code and then swap it in for your own. Now, to implement an element or section-specific custom cursor, we need one more thing: the type of element or area we want to target. I'm going to show you a couple of examples, but let's start with the one from the demo. We're going to target all A elements on the page by targeting all A's via CSS. So basically, that is just going to look like this. Next, we're going to add in our custom image. To do this, we need the cursor property, cursor, typed in correctly, followed by the URL with our file, and then a fallback of auto. So I'm just going to add that in here, auto. There we go. Since we're going very global with this modification because we're targeting any A element on the site, there is a chance that on your project you may need to override any previous cursor value by force. In that case, you can use important in your code like this. However, if you see your cursor showing up correctly without it, don't use it because that means that there's no need for it. So I'm going to go ahead and keep it out of my code because I already know I'm not going to use it for this level of customization that I'm achieving. Now, right after adding our image, you're going to see that if I go over those A elements on the site, I get the custom cursor showing up. So that's awesome. However, I don't know if you can tell, but this looks a little bit misaligned. I want the middle of this sort of bullseye to be the middle of the cursor. So to fix this, I'm going to modify the position coordinates of the cursor, which actually sounds way more complex than it actually is. Basically, keeping in mind that the cursor is 32 pixels by 32 pixels, at least in my case, I'm going to pick the spot I want to use as the center of the cursor. So I'm going to be using 18 for the x-axis and 18 for the y-axis. So that number goes here right after the URL of the image. So now if I take a look at the cursor, you're going to see how now the middle of the bullseye is actually in the middle of the link. Now, I don't know if you spotted this the first time I hovered over the links. So for example, here, if I step over the title of the drop-down folder, the title itself doesn't show that new cursor, even though it is a clickable element, but the elements inside them, these 2 links, do show it. Another example is the summary arrows here. So you can see that if I stand over them, they don't really show the new cursor, even though other parts of the summary block, like the image itself, the title here, and the read more link do show this new image. This is happening because these elements, although they are clickable, they're not A elements, which is what I'm targeting in the code. So therefore, there's no current modification applied to them. Let's go ahead and take a look at what the company link is actually built out of. So looking here through the inspect element tool, I can see here that the company text is a span element, and this one is sitting within a button element, not an A element. So neither of these things or neither of these parts of that folder title are A elements. So that's why the code that I'm using in here is not applying to it. The way to fix it is to basically now target this element. I can either target the span or I can target the button, because here you're going to see that if I stand over the span element, only the blue part showcased here is going to get the new cursor. Because I want the full effect on the whole button, I'm going to be targeting this. However, keep in mind that here on the right side, you're going to see that this button element has already a cursor set up as pointer. This means that if I want to change this value, the easier route would be to reuse what Squarespace is already using to set up that initial value in the code. Because if I were to use only the button element selector, that's not going to be precise or specific enough to be able to override this value. So let me show you what I mean. If I were to, again, just use the button type of element as the selector, just like I did with the A ones, you're going to see that if I go over the company link, nothing is happening. Now, the reason why nothing is happening is because if I go back into the button element, we're going to see here on the right side that the snippet that I just added to the custom CSS window is being crossed off. That is because the way that I told the browser what to target is way less specific than the way that Squarespace is doing it. Now, this is the reason why I said before, sometimes you may need to use important in your code to be able to override this cursor. If I do that and then go back into my value here and add important, you're going to see how now the cursor is going to show up. That is because that important is forcibly going over the original cursor pointer value. If you wanted to do it in a cleaner way, then the way to go would be to simply reuse what Squarespace is using as its original selector and then targeting the button through that instead. Then here I wouldn't need the important rule anymore. And if I go onto the company link, I still get the custom cursor. Now, the limitation with this approach is that this is specifically targeting that button inside the header nav. So if you wanted to target other buttons across the site, you would need to either go back to the previous method that I showed you with the important rule, or you would need to start adding in and grouping selectors for each of the different buttons that you have across the site. I'm going to go back to the previous method just to keep it more generic and easier for you to use in one go. But nonetheless, keep in mind that whenever you can, try to avoid using important. Anyway, let's go back and put it back in. And now, because I want the cursor to show up on both my A elements and the button elements as well, I'm going to go back in, add my A selector, and then I'm going to simply group it with the button one. And now I'm going to have the custom cursor showing up on A elements as well as those button elements like this one in the nav. Now here's the thing. If I go onto the arrows that we have for the summary block, these ones still do not show that custom cursor. So let's go ahead and take a look at what these ones are built out of so that we can see how we can target them in our code and implement the same customization. All right, so these ones here are span elements. And then if I open these up, they simply have a pseudo element inside them. There's no button, there's no A element, nothing like that around this. Now, the issue with this is that span elements are usually used to hold text. So if I were to do it in this very global fashion and just target all span elements across the site, I'm going to be targeting much more than I actually want to modify. So in this case, what we can do is use one of the other parts of this structure as our selector. I'm going to be going with the class of summary carousel pager next to be able to target that next button. But you're going to see that this class, because it's different to the one that is being held by the previous button, is obviously only going to affect the next button and not the previous one. So let's go ahead and do that just to show you what's going to happen. I'm going to group it here. And now if I go over that next arrow, I do get the cursor showing up. But if I go over the previous arrow, I don't, because I don't have the class for it targeted in here in the CSS. I have a plugin inside the snippet directory that targets any kind of clickable stuff automatically for you. So you don't really need to do this if you don't want to. The link is in the description box in case you want to check it out. But I wanted to show you how the process goes if what you want to do is have full control over where that cursor is going to show up. So now that you have a pretty good idea of how you can target different elements, let's go ahead and focus on how you can target specific sections. For this, I'm going to be using the footer sections as an example. So I just have this very thin footer over here, And right now, because the code is currently targeting all my A elements, all my button elements, and that next summary carousel pager, the code is currently applying to this A element that I have inside the footer. But what happens if what you want is to only target A elements within the footer or within any other area of the site? Then in that case, you need a slightly different selector. So what you're going to do is target all of the A elements, but within the footer sections container. Footer sections container. And just in case you're wondering, that ID that I'm just using in there, I got it from the footer container over here. So this one, you can see that it carries an ID of footer sections. So that's the one that I'm using to target only A elements within the footer sections area. So what this means is that now if I go back into my previous A elements, these ones are not going to carry the cursor. So you can see here that the regular cursor is showing up for all of these previously targeted A elements. But now if I go onto this one inside the footer section, this is the only one that is going to display my custom cursor. Now, if you wanted to take this one step further or backwards, however you want to see it, if you wanted to have the cursor showing up for the entirety of the section, whether that is the footer section or anything else, then it's a matter of targeting the whole section itself, not a specific element within it. Now, here's where you need to be careful because it really depends on how strict you want the code to be in terms of what gets targeted. So here, for example, if I wanted to target the whole footer sections container, I would just remove that A element, and now any part of that container is going to get the custom cursor. Even the things that are not clickable are going to get the custom cursor. But now if I send over the A element, that one is not going to have it. Why? Because this one already carries that pointer cursor set up as its default. So here inside the A element itself, we're going to see that there's going to be a little code down here, a bit of CSS that is just a default that is going to set the cursor to pointer for A elements. So if you wanted the cursor to apply to the entirety of the container and also to clickable things, which are usually the ones that have a different cursor applied to them, then it's a matter of targeting both the footer sections and the clickable elements inside it. So now if I go over any part of the section, I still get my cursor. If I go over the text, I get the cursor. And if I go over the clickable element, I get the custom cursor as well. Alrighty, so there you have it. Now you know how to implement a custom cursor for specific elements or areas of your site with roughly 3 lines of code, depending on how far you want to take it. If you have any comments or questions, go ahead and leave them down below. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time.